Hello everyone, thank you so much for having me this evening. It's lovely to be back in my university town. It's really nice actually to have a little wander around and just see how the city's changed so much in the last kind of 10 years. But while I was studying here, I actually had my very first job in a estate agency, and I worked for a rival estate agents in Headington. I was their Saturday girl who ran around Headington doing viewings on all of these lovely student properties. That was complete carnage. And that's really what kind of brought about my love for property. Oxford was also where I bought my first home, which later turned into the first of a couple of buy-to-lets in our portfolio. So it feels like a real full circle moment to be here with you all this evening. And my job today is to give you a little bit of a briefing on what we're seeing in the housing market at the moment, and particularly focusing on what's next for buy-to-let. So let's get the bad news out of the way, shall we? Because I am a half full kind of person. So I think, as Doug's already touched on actually, the buy-to-let sector has gone through and faced numerous challenges over the last 10 years. We've had the introduction of a stamp duty surcharge, the removal of mortgage interest tax relief, removal of wear and tear allowances, tighter EBC regulations, the list goes on and on and on. And in the last couple of years, what's really hurt a lot of investors is the rise in mortgage rates, and of course the latest increase in stamp duty surcharge on second homes as well. As we all know, the headlines haven't been great about the world of buy-to-let, but actually from our perspective, the sector has remained very resilient, and landlords have actually adapted pretty well to a number of these changes. Now, probably the biggest saving grace for investors over the last couple of years in particular is what's happened to rents. So this graph here shows you the annual change in rental growth across Great Britain for both newly let properties, so when a new tenant moves in, and those on tenancy renewals as well. And what you can see is we saw quite strong rental growth, and actually by quite strong I mean record-breaking rental growth across the country in around 2022 to 2023 period. And actually back then, rent rises of around 10% year on year were not uncommon. But naturally, as affordability starts to become a little bit more constrained, rental growth's been slowing over the last couple of years. And we have a lettings index that's powered by data from across our Connells group, and that actually showed that rents fell year on year by 0.4% in August, and that was the first fall we've seen in rents for quite some time. And actually it was the second biggest fall since our records ever began. What this graph also shows you is that actually rents on renewed tenancies are still rising a fair amount. So the typical rent on a renewal is still up around 4% year on year. And that's mainly because landlords, like you I'm sure, actually don't put up the rent as often on existing tenants. So there's always a little bit of catching up to do. Rents on newly let properties that are advertised on the open market tend to rise a little bit quicker. But we do expect, as you can see, that those renewal rents will probably start to catch up, and we expect to see a little bit of slower growth there. So Doug's already given you a few Oxford stats, but I'm going to give you some Oxfordshire stats, if you like, which capture the whole market, not just the finders keepers world. And actually what's really interesting when I was crunching these numbers this week is Oxfordshire has pretty much been the bellwether of rents across the country. So the average rent in Oxfordshire passed the £1,700 a month mark back in 2024, and the average rent now stands at £1,723 per calendar month. But Great Britain rents have actually risen around 35% over the last 5 years, and that happens to be the exactly same figure as in Oxfordshire, so you clearly are setting the trends here. As you can see on this map here on the right-hand side, that again shows you rental growth over the last 5 years, you can see that those dark coral areas that have seen the biggest increases have typically been on the outskirts of Oxfordshire. So the top performers over the last 5 years have been OX7, which is Chipping Norton, OX49 and Watlington, and both of those areas have seen rents rise by 50% over just a 5-year period. But of course we've lived in a very inflationary driven world over the last couple of years, and I think what's quite interesting when we look at these numbers is some of those rental growth figures sound absolutely bananas, and I know a lot of tenants are really feeling the pain from that. So this chart here and the table on the right, you can see that rents have risen 35% over the last 5 years. But actually, inflation's risen 28%. So yes, rents have outperformed inflation, but possibly not quite as much as people actually expect. And again, this chart here, you can see that the southeast has mirrored exactly what's been happening across the country as a whole. So yes, Oxfordshire has seen rents rise 35% over 5 years, the same as the southeast, which has meant that rents have risen in real terms. And that mostly reflects the fact that we've got a lack of supply, particularly in places like Oxford. And it also reflects the fact that landlords' costs have risen, as I'm sure most of you in this room are aware of, whether that's your mortgage, if you have debt on your portfolio, or just your kind of maintenance costs and things as well. But overall, these figures have really kind of dampened affordability for tenants, and they are leaving them worse off, and that's one of the reasons why we have seen struggles in the sector, in some parts of the sector, over the last few years. So what does this rental growth actually mean in terms of yields? Well, strong rental growth and the fact that we've seen rents outpace house price growth over the last couple of years has pushed up yields. So the average yield on a new buy-to-let investment across England and Wales at the moment is 7.1%. And that's risen from 6% in 2019. And that might not sound like a big increase, but actually yields typically don't move very much. In the southeast, the typical yield being achieved at the moment is 6.5%, and that's risen from 5.2% in 2019. But what this chart shows you is how your kind of yield varies over time and how rental growth can affect your investment. So this very, very pale grey line here shows you that back in 2015, someone that purchased a buy-to-let 10 years ago was probably achieving around a 6% return on their investment. But because rents have grown so much over that period, they're now receiving around an 8% rental yield. So it just kind of gives landlords that little bit more headroom. But I think what's also quite interesting is even landlords who have newly invested in the market in the last couple of years, so you can see here the 2024 line in the dark colour, even new investors have been achieving yields of over a 7% on average from only holding an investment for just a couple of years. And as interest rates start to come down, like we've seen over the last 12 or so months, some of these yields on paper at least are starting to look a little bit more attractive versus leaving cash in the bank. I'm sure many of you get constant reminders at the moment about how savings rates are going down. So as Doug mentioned as well, I think there's been a lot of talk recently about are landlords selling up or are they newly investing in the world of buy-to-let. And this chart here shows you how that behaviour has changed over time. So the coral line shows you the share of homes in Great Britain that have been bought by buy-to-let investors, and you can see that since 2016 time, that figure has been dwindling, and again, that comes back to the tax changes and regulatory changes that have been put in place. Meanwhile, the share of homes sold by landlords on that blue line actually peaked in 2022, and it's actually been dwindling and coming down a little bit over the last couple of years. And again, I think this highlights some of the resilience in the sector. I think a lot of the landlords, particularly who were concerned about the tapering of mortgage interest tax relief, actually cashed out quite a few years ago. We're now kind of left with a bit more of a landlord base who are trying to adapt, move their portfolio around, restructure it, and they're trying to kind of stick it out because they see it as a long-term investment horizon. There's been a slight uptick this year, but nothing sort of major that we're overly concerned about. And interestingly, we're starting to see a few more sort of promising signs in the world of buy-to-let. So UK Finance, who tell us how many buy-to-let loans are taken out, showed us that actually there were 39% more buy-to-let loans on new purchases granted in Q1 this year versus Q1 last year. Now, admittedly, Q1 last year didn't have too many buy-to-let purchases, so it is an increase from a low base, but nonetheless, there does seem to be a little bit more appetite around at the moment. And on this right-hand side here, you can see there's some regional numbers about the share of homes bought by investors in London, the southeast. London's been really hit hard by a lot of these tax changes on buy-to-let because property's so expensive there and yields tend to be a little bit lower. But the eagle eyes of you might see that actually this southeastern pillar here has seen a slight increase year on year. So there's a little bit more buy-to-let appetite around in the southeast this year than there was last year. But landlords are certainly adapting to their new environment rather than selling. And this chart here shows you the number of new buy-to-let limited companies that have been set up over time. So far this year, I think it's from January to August, we've seen 44,802 new buy-to-let incorporations. And that's an 8% year-on-year increase, and you can just see how quickly these numbers have picked up, particularly since some of these tax changes have come into play. There are now 700,000 buy-to-lets across the country that are held in limited companies, and we think that around 3/4 of new buy-to-let investments are going into these limited companies rather than people owning in their own names. And a lot of that is down to the tax advantages of holding buy-to-lets in limited companies rather than in your personal names. So another interesting trend that we're seeing with this data is we can see exactly who's setting up these companies, what properties they own, and where they own these properties. And we can see that while a lot of the growth in incorporations has come from quite smaller landlords who possibly only have 1 or 2 buy-to-let properties, it's the bigger landlords that are actively adding to their portfolios at the moment and have been doing so for the last couple of years. So I guess the big question that I'm always asked is, well, what on earth is going to happen to house prices and what on earth is going to happen to rents over the next couple of years? And I have to say, up until about a month ago, I thought our forecasts were pretty close, but there's certainly quite a lot more economic uncertainty that's come up in the last month or so. Back in November, we forecast that house prices across Great Britain were going to rise by 3.5% next year, but the economy is definitely weakening, and there are certainly a little bit more uncertainty around future tax changes, as Doug was alluding to, in the budget. And I'm more than happy to talk about all things budget related after, should someone want to grill me. But I think realistically, we're now expecting house prices to grow a little bit less next year, probably around the 2% mark, particularly in more expensive markets like London and Oxford as well. We might even see price growth stabilise next year. But actually, in terms of rents, we still have quite an optimistic outlook on what we think is going to happen to rental growth. There is a chronic undersupply of good quality rental homes across the country, and landlords' costs are rising too, which will continue to put a little bit of pressure on rents over the next couple of years. And even though tenant demand has weakened a little bit over the last year or so, which has taken some of the heat out of rents, we still think rents will probably rise in line with incomes around the kind of 3% mark over the next couple of years. So overall, I'd say a fairly stable outlook for both house price growth and rental growth, but certainly a little bit more sort of problems or a bit more uncertainty creeping in for the sales market over the next 12 months. So just finally, in terms of some kind of other broader themes that we think will be happening in the buy-to-let world over the next year or so, where we've seen rental growth soften a little bit this year and house prices kind of pick up and begin their recovery, means that we're probably quite close to yields hitting their peak, which basically means now is quite a good time to buy. But on paper, I think what we are seeing is that yields for buy-to-let do look quite good, particularly compared to some of the other investments like leaving the cash in the bank or some of the volatile stock markets. And I think that's why in some of the numbers we are starting to see a little bit more interest in buy-to-let purchases now. Some people think that we're near the bottom of the market. I'm not quite so sure about that in some areas, particularly prime central London, but we are seeing some more investors kind of start to purchase again, which is a little bit more reassuring. But lingering over all of this, and David is the expert on all this, I can grant for that, is all of this potentially sort of legislative and taxation changes that are probably coming our way in the next few months, or if not within the next year. And we know that is kind of dampening things down a little bit. So I think it's clear, really fair to say that buy-to-let probably isn't dead. But a consolidation is well underway, and in reality what that means is that there are probably going to be fewer landlords around, but those fewer landlords are probably going to hold larger, more professional portfolios. And realistically, that's kind of exactly what the government intended to do with a lot of this legislation. So I hope that's given you a bit of an outlook about how we're kind of feeling about the buy-to-let world at the moment. More than happy to take questions at the end, but in the meantime, I will hand you back to Paul, I believe.